Number 12. Nikki Secondino. All hell broke loose at an apartment building in Brooklyn's Bensonhurst neighborhood early one morning in 2023. A resident overheard her neighbor, 61-year-old Carlo Secondino, screaming for help. Carlo's daughter, 22-year-old Nikki Secondino, banged on the woman's door and demanded help. The neighbor opened her door to find a hallway spattered with blood. Not wanting to get involved for obvious reasons, she immediately went back into her apartment and dialed 911. Responding officers found Carlo dead and his 19-year-old daughter, Liana, clinging to life. Lana was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Meanwhile, Nikki claimed that a pair of burglars had broken in and attacked her father and sister. The NYPD launched a manhunt, only to call it off hours later after they began to strongly suspect that Nikki was lying. There were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, and a window had been broken from inside. A neighbor told the New York Daily News that Nikki and Carlo had a volatile relationship and could often be heard fighting. Several other people made similar statements, including a co-worker of Carlo's and a local exterminator, who said that the fights between the father and daughter sometimes became physical. Despite these issues, people who knew the family said that Carlo tried to do what was best for his daughter, who is transgender. And although he espoused some markedly right-wing views on social media, he supported and paid for Nikki's transition. After Carlo's murder, police noticed cuts on Nikki that were consistent with a knife slipping in someone's hand during a stabbing. During questioning, she allegedly confessed to murdering her family in cold blood, after being told that she had 30 days to move out and learning that they planned to pursue a restraining order against her. Authorities charged Nikki with murder, attempted murder, and criminal possession of a weapon. She's currently being held at Rikers without bail and could face life in prison if convicted. Number 11. Joanna Dennehy. 48-year-old property developer Kevin Lee was found dead in a ditch outside Peterborough, England in March 2013. He had been stabbed multiple times and dressed in a black sequin dress, as if to emasculate him even in death. A few days later, the similarly murdered remains of 31-year-old Polish national Lukasz Labaszewski and 56-year-old John Chapman were found near the village of Thorney. All three men had one woman in common: Joanna Dennehy. Kevin Lee was Dennehy's landlord and lover. Lukasz Labaszewski had recently met her at a bar and drank with her, and John Chapman was her roommate. Police traced the murders to Dennehy after finding Lee's body. They soon learned that she had carried out her crimes with the help from an accomplice, who was identified as 47-year-old Gary Stretch. Dennehy killed the three men over a 10-day span. After claiming her third victim, she stabbed two male dog walkers at random. One of the last two victims, John Rogers, was stabbed over 40 times. He and the other dog walker survived, and Dennehy fell short of her stated goal of killing 9 men in order to be like Bonnie and Clyde. Gary Stretch and another alleged accomplice, 36-year-old Leslie Layton, claimed that they only went along with the crimes out of fear. A look into Dennehy's past revealed a troubling pattern of addiction, crime, and profound mental illness. While being booked into custody, she joked around and laughed like it was any other day, and even flirted with a male officer. Dennehy told police that she targeted men specifically and avoided killing women, especially women with kids. She admitted to killing the victims for entertainment and said that the first 3 murders left her with a craving to continue killing. After discovering her plan to escape custody by cutting off a guard's finger and using his fingerprint to get through the security system, jail staff put Dennehy in solitary confinement, where she remained for 2 years leading up to her trial. She ultimately pleaded guilty to all 3 murders and was sentenced to life in prison. In a relatively rare move in Britain's criminal justice system, the judge imposed a whole life order, which means that Dennehy will remain behind bars until her dying day. Number 10. Dustin Lee Honkin and Angela Johnson. In 1992, Dustin Lee Honkin became one of the biggest methamphetamine producers in the United States. He set up shop in Arizona and routinely trafficked the drug to 2 dealers in his hometown of Mason City, Iowa. Within a year of starting the operation, Honkin and his best friend, Tim Cutcomb, were nabbed on federal drug trafficking charges. Like almost any other major drug case, prosecutors were relying on testimony from one of Honkin's dealers, Greg Nicholson, to secure a conviction. Authorities had previously arrested Nicholson after finding a large amount of meth in his house. He agreed to turn into the state's witness and help gather evidence against Honkin in exchange for leniency. After finding out that Nicholson had worn a wire during a conversation about a drug deal, Honkin was livid. And just like that, Nicholson, his girlfriend, Laurie Ann Duncan, and Laurie's 2 kids vanished. Without Nicholson's testimony, the government's case against Honkin was severely weakened. But the feds weren't going to back down without a fight. They soon began to target Honkin's other main dealer, Terry DeGuse, who also conveniently disappeared before he could testify against Honkin. Without any more witnesses to help with the case, the government was left with no choice but to drop the charges. Honkin and Cutcomb went back to manufacturing and selling meth, but were busted again in the fall of 1995. This time, Cutcomb cooperated with authorities and gathered evidence of Honkin admitting to murdering the 5 missing witnesses. And he was planning to kill several more people in connection with the new drug case. In one chilling recording, Cutcomb asked Honkin if the fact that he was a killer bothered him. He said no, that he didn't even think about it. Honkin pleaded guilty to the drug charges and was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The judge declined to rule on whether he was involved in the witness disappearances. A breakthrough in the case finally came in 2000 after a jailhouse informant convinced Honkin to draw maps of where he buried the missing bodies. Around the same time, Christy Gorbat, a former friend of Honkin's girlfriend Angela Johnson, went to the police to share what she knew. She was too scared to speak up before, but her conscience could no longer allow her to remain quiet. Investigators learned that Angela Johnson went to Nicholson's house pretending to be a saleswoman. Honkin barged in from behind her, and they forced the first 4 victims into a car at gunpoint. The couple drove the family out to a secluded area and executed them in cold blood. 5 months later, Johnson lured Terry DeGuse to a country club, then drove him to an abandoned house where Honkin beat and shot him. 7 years later, the remains of all 5 victims were recovered, and Honkin and Johnson were federally charged with multiple counts of murder. They were both found guilty and sentenced to death. Honkin was executed by lethal injection in 2020 after exhausting all his appeals, while Johnson's sentence was eventually commuted to life without parole. Number 9. Laura Rideout. Devoted father of 7, Craig Rideout would have never abandoned his children. His loved ones immediately suspected foul play when the 50-year-old computer programmer vanished from his home near Rochester, New York in 2016. Craig's sister, Robin Drew, began to fear the worst when she found blood spatter inside Craig's house, and she was also suspicious to find his ex-wife, Laura, at the home cleaning. The family's fears were soon confirmed, with the discovery of Craig's badly disfigured body in a wooded area about 50 miles, 80.5 kilometers away. He was wrapped in a tarp, and his face and hands had been burned with acid. An autopsy would later rule that Craig was strangled to death. In the 2 years leading up to his murder, Craig had gone through a bitter custody battle with Laura, who had an affair and moved in with his best friend, Paul Tucci. The former couple's older children were allowed to choose which parent they wanted to live with, while Craig won custody of the 2 youngest. This became a problem for Laura when she and Tucci made plans to move to North Carolina and failed to get Craig's or the court's permission to take the 2 youngest kids with them. So it's no surprise that both police and Craig's family immediately suspected Laura and Paul of being involved. Their suspicions heightened when cops ran into Craig's 2 adult sons, Colin and Alexander, while they were disposing of some garbage bags at a local pond called the Devil's Bathtub. Inside the bags, police found empty bottles of cleaner, gloves, bloody clothing, and some other items. Forensic analysis connected the evidence to the brothers, as well as Laura and Paul. Law enforcement recovered surveillance footage of Paul Tucci's car and Craig's van heading in the direction of the crime scene. They also found videos of Laura and Paul buying a large amount of cleaning supplies, which the couple claimed they used to clean their house before moving. Authorities charged Paul, Laura, Colin, and Alexander with murder and various other charges surrounding Craig's death. During the trial, prosecutors described how Laura had allegedly turned several of the children against Craig. Just days before Craig's murder, after he refused to allow Laura to take the younger children to North Carolina, Colin had emailed his father, accusing him of being manipulative and abusive. A few months earlier, Colin and Laura had exchanged text messages with plans to have two of the other kids stage an incident in an effort to get Craig's custody taken away. Their plan involved provoking Craig's temper and capturing evidence of his reaction to prove that he was an unfit parent. And these attempts clearly did not work because Craig still had custody of the kids when he was killed, making it easy for prosecutors to establish a motive in court. All four defendants were tried together, and each defendant's attorney pointed the finger at their co-defendants during the trial, causing the family's initially united front to collapse. The jury acquitted Paul Tucci of the charges, found Alexander Rideout guilty of tampering with evidence, and convicted Laura and Colin Rideout of second-degree murder. Laura and Colin were sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Alexander received a 2 to 8 year sentence, which he has finished serving, and Tucci walked free. Number 8. Stephen Michael Cook Jr. Stephen Michael Cook Jr. arrived home one evening in April 2000 and found his girlfriend, 24-year-old Heidi Bernat-Zykowski, dead and bleeding on the floor of their Dundalk, Maryland townhouse. When police arrived, they found him in hysterics as he cradled Heidi's lifeless body in his arms. She had been strangled and cut across the throat. Detectives noticed that the home looked ransacked, yet there were plenty of valuables that hadn't been taken, leading them to suspect that the scene was staged to look like a robbery gone wrong. On the wall in pink lipstick, the killer had written "Number 1, and investigators weren't sure if it had a hidden meaning or if it was put there in an attempt to mislead them. During questioning, Cook adamantly denied any involvement in Heidi's murder. He said he picked her up from her job at 5 o'clock in the evening and took her home because she had to use the bathroom. He didn't want to wait for her, so he left again on his own to run some errands. Cook insisted that his relationship with Heidi was going well and provided documentation to prove his alibi. But investigators were troubled when they learned that the couple had hefty life insurance policies, despite having very average jobs. Cook worked part-time at a Lowe's home improvement store and Heidi was a secretary, yet their policies were for $900,000 and $700,000. Police also learned that the relationship between Stephen and Heidi wasn't as picture-perfect as he made it sound. In fact, while they once had plans to marry, things had become rocky and Heidi had been thinking about leaving Stephen. But without enough evidence to implicate Cook, the cops had no choice but to let him go for the time being and focus their efforts elsewhere. Shortly before the murder, Heidi had answered the door to a stranger who said he wanted to start a neighborhood watch program. She didn't recognize him, and she got bad vibes, so she ended the conversation quickly. After going back inside, she made a drawing of a distinctive tattoo she had noticed on the man's forearm, just in case, God forbid, the need to identify him ever arose. All leads ran dry, and the case went cold. 11 years later, DNA technology had come a long way, and detectives decided to run the crime scene evidence to see if they could get a hit. To their complete shock, they obtained a profile that matched to a man in Colorado named Alexander Bennett, who also had a tattoo matching the drawing Heidi had made years earlier of the creepy neighborhood watch guy. Police flew to Colorado and interviewed Bennett, who said he ended up living on the streets in Maryland after his friends abandoned him on their way to a concert. When confronted with the DNA evidence, which came from beneath Heidi's fingernails, Bennett claimed he was attacked by a crazy woman at a bus stop. But one of his friends told investigators that Lewis had admitted to stabbing someone, and he was arrested on suspicion of murder. Bennett finally decided to talk at the 11th hour, right before his trial was about to start. He admitted to killing Heidi and implicated his friend and the prosecution's star witness, Grant Lewis, claiming that the men traveled to Baltimore after being hired as hitmen by Cook. The men had advertised their services online in hopes of raising enough money to open their own nightclub. Cook never paid the $60,000 he had promised to Lewis and Bennett for the hit, and he only received 20% of Heidi's life insurance payout after being sued by her family. In exchange for his cooperation, Bennett was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years. Lewis and Cook were both found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. Cook unsuccessfully appealed his conviction and continues to maintain his innocence as he pursues another appeal through the Supreme Court. Number 7. Amy Perez Meyer and Billy Hoffman. When 21-year-old Ricky Cowles began dating Amy Perez Meyer in 1997, his parents disapproved because of their age gap and banned Amy from coming over to their property. So Ricky rented his own place in Lancaster, California, and it wasn't long before Amy moved in. She soon began to move her friends in, and the condo became known as a party house, which Ricky wasn't too crazy about. By the time Amy discovered that she was pregnant, sparks between the couple had started to fizzle. Amy's friends were still staying at the condo, even though Ricky wanted them gone, and he disapproved of their drug use. He began to think maybe Amy wasn't the one for him after all. But he felt a responsibility toward his unborn child, and he believed that making his relationship with Amy work was a part of fulfilling his fatherly duties. Ricky and Amy vowed to work on things and made plans to have some time alone together one August evening. Despite these plans, Amy went to the fair with some friends, then returned home with her friend Sarah Chapin. The young women went upstairs to find Ricky bludgeoned and shot in the head. He was clinging to life, but was unable to tell paramedics who attacked him. Emergency responders airlifted him to the hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery but succumbed to his injuries. Ricky's family found Amy's behavior odd. In a 2023 Dateline interview, his mother recalled hearing her son's pregnant girlfriend say her final goodbyes to Ricky and expressing her disappointment about how he had promised to buy her a car for her birthday. But the case languished for months without any suspects being identified. Authorities caught their first big break when a young man who had gotten arrested and was hoping for leniency tipped him off to a suspect named Billy Hoffman. Within days of the murder, Hoffman had bragged to multiple people about being the shooter, yet nobody had come forward. He was arrested in April 1998, roughly 7 months after the crime, and denied any involvement in the crime, but was convicted of murder. Hoffman was sentenced to life without parole, and while this marked a major step toward justice for Ricky, his family didn't believe Billy committed the murder on his own. He had no reason to. Billy and Ricky didn't even know each other, despite having mutual friends, yet he hadn't implicated anyone else in the crime. Suspecting that he killed Ricky for someone and protected that person's identity, Ricky's loved ones spent years hoping for the next big break in the case. It finally came in 2002, when they received a letter from Billy Hoffman containing a full confession. He wrote that he had killed Ricky at the urging of Amy Perez Meyer and her friend, Jennifer Kellogg. In a tearful interview with Dateline reporter Keith Morrison, Hoffman admitted that he agreed to commit the shooting because he wanted to be cool and emulate the gangster rap he was listening to at the time. In the years since, he came to deeply regret his actions and their impact on the victims' loved ones. Ricky's family turned the letter over to law enforcement, and after 3 more years of investigating and turning up new information, authorities charged Amy and Jennifer in connection with the murder. The 2 women were put in a jail cell together, unaware that it was wired and recording their conversations. Jennifer refused to say much, but Amy was captured whispering about the idea of killing Billy Hoffman, so he couldn't testify against them as the prosecution's star witness. But that never happened, and in 2007, the decade-old case finally went to trial. Amy maintained her innocence, arguing that she had no motive for killing Ricky. But the jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to life without parole. Jennifer Kellogg took a deal and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and solicitation of murder. She was sentenced to 17 years in prison. In a shocking twist, Billy Hoffman was released on parole in 2020 due to a new state law granting new consideration to youthful offenders. Amy also applied to benefit under the new law, but for now she remains behind bars, with an earliest possible parole date of 2029. Number 6. Mario Fernandez Saldana. While driving down a wooded road in Jacksonville Beach, Florida in February 2022, 33-year-old Microsoft executive and father of 4, Jared Bridegan, spotted a tire in the middle of the road. When he got out to move it, someone gunned him down in a fatal ambush he never saw coming. His daughter was in the car when it happened. Suspicion immediately turned to Bridegan's ex-wife, Shana Gardner Fernandez. Although the former couple had been divorced for 7 years, their battles over money and custody of the 2 children they shared were never-ending. Shana denied any involvement in her ex-husband's murder, but remained on law enforcement's radar as they chased down leads in search of the truth. In January 2023, authorities announced the arrest of 61-year-old Henry Tenon, who was a tenant of Shana's current husband, 34-year-old Mario Fernandez Saldana. According to prosecutors, Tenon pulled the trigger in the shooting. He took a deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his cooperation against his co-conspirators. He faces 15 years to life in prison. 2 months later, in March 2023, Mario was charged with first-degree murder with a weapon, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, solicitation to commit a capital felony, and child abuse. He's accused of hiring Tenon to shoot Bridegan. According to court documents, the suspects planned the killing more than a month in advance. Bank and phone records reportedly revealed that Fernandez Saldana wrote several checks to Tenon and that the 2 exchanged dozens of phone calls in the weeks leading up to the murder. Prosecutors have made it clear that they intend to seek the death penalty against Fernandez Saldana, an announcement that came on the heels of a new state law that only requires 8 out of 12 jurors to vote in favor of death in order to impose the sentence. For many, questions linger about Shana Gardner Fernandez's possible involvement in the crime. Her attorney declined to comment, and the investigation is ongoing. In the meantime, sources told News 4 Jax that she has moved to Washington State to be near her family. Number 5. Colin Dudley. Colin Dudley had a live-in girlfriend and didn't want children, but he reconnected with his ex-girlfriend Cassandra Cantrell. Things happened between them, and 33-year-old Cassandra became pregnant in 2020. She was excited to be a mom, and she was under the impression that Colin planned to take responsibility for his role as the father. In reality, he was desperately looking to escape it in any way possible. Cassandra had a best friend and was close with her mother, yet neither of them had any idea where she was when she disappeared the day before her first ultrasound. She was last seen driving away from her mother's house near Tacoma, Washington. Her social media activity also stopped that day, which was highly out of character. Authorities found her car abandoned with the keys inside near downtown Tacoma, but there was no sign of Cassandra herself. Law enforcement worked around the clock in an effort to find the mother-to-be, and the FBI joined the search within days of Cassandra's disappearance. They quickly narrowed their sights on Colin Dudley, who denied any knowledge of his ex-girlfriend's whereabouts or involvement in the case. In fact, Colin claimed he hadn't spoken to Cassandra in years, but investigators knew that was a lie. Phone records proved that Cassandra was at Colin's home on the morning of her disappearance. From there, it was traced to Puget Sound before becoming untraceable. By some miracle, or perhaps some really good detective work, they managed to retrieve the phone from the water. About a month after Cassandra vanished, GPS data from Colin's truck led police to a nearby town, where they found the missing woman's body wrapped in garbage bags in a ravine. She had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Surveillance footage from the day of the murder showed Colin buying garbage bags at a Costco store, and they also uncovered video of him walking through a light rail station very close to where Cassandra's car was found. He was wearing a fedora and blue latex gloves in the video. Investigators traced his movements to a nearby parking garage, where he was seen getting into his truck and driving away. Unswayed by Dudley's claims of innocence and his girlfriend's backing, authorities charged him with first-degree murder. He took a deal and pleaded guilty in exchange for a 26-year prison sentence. Number 4. Sheila Keane Warren. In a disturbing case that haunted detectives for nearly 30 years, Marlena Warren answered the front door of her Wellington, Florida home one morning in 1990 to find a clown standing there with carnations and balloons. The clown handed the items to Warren, who responded, "Oh, how nice," as the clown pulled a gun and shot her in the face, killing her right in front of her son and his friends. Investigators were baffled by the bizarre case, which left the historically safe community shaken and looking over their shoulder. At the time, Marlena's husband, Michael, was having an affair with a woman named Sheila Keane Warren, who he eventually married. The couple were questioned, and detectives learned that Sheila had recently worn a clown costume for a promotional gig at an auto parts store. But there wasn't enough evidence to charge her, and the case went cold. The sheriff's cold case squad finally reopened it in 2014. Between fresh detective work and advances in DNA technology, they finally came up with enough evidence to charge Sheila with Marlena's murder. Among the new discoveries was a piece of Sheila's hair that was found in the getaway car. She was arrested in 2017 in North Carolina, where she and Michael Warren had been living since tying the knot in 2002. Sheila initially faced a first-degree murder charge, which carries a punishment of either life in prison or death in the state of Florida. She insisted she was innocent, but pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2023 as part of a generous plea offer that may see her released from prison in as little as 16 months. The deal comes with a sentence of 12 years, with credit for the 5.5 years Sheila spent in county jail while the case was pending. Because the murder happened over 30 years ago, her sentence will be subject to the laws that were in place at the time, which had generous gain time incentives. Sentencing laws are stricter today, but they do not apply to Sheila's case. Number 3. Richie Wilder Jr. and Cynthia Wilder. 30-year-old mother of 3, Angela Wilder, had a promising future to look forward to after divorcing the father of her first 2 children. She was pursuing her nursing degree at Minot University in North Dakota, was in a happy relationship with her fiancé, Chris Jackson, and had recently learned that she was expecting her 4th child. But Angela's life plans were interrupted in 2015 when someone entered her house and stabbed her 40 times while Chris was at work. Chris arrived home in the morning after working 3rd shift to find the back door kicked in and immediately dialed 911. During the call, he said that he was about to go inside, but the operator told him not to. Chris obeyed the instruction and would soon come under scrutiny by law enforcement for not entering the home anyway. Police struggled to reconcile the idea of a man who was worried about his family obediently waiting outside the home for officers to arrive. It made them wonder if Chris was somehow involved in his fiancée's murder. But he insisted he wasn't, and told investigators that Angela had been nervous about staying home alone when he left for work the night before. She thought she had heard someone tampering with the front door the previous evening and had recently felt like she was being watched. After confirming Chris's alibi, detectives moved on to the next name that popped up on their list, Angela's ex-husband, Richie Wilder Jr. They had overheard Chris mentioning Richie during a phone call he made in the interrogation room, and would soon discover that Angela and Richie were entangled in a vicious custody dispute over their 2 children at the time of the murder. What's more, Richie had been kicked out of the military for domestic violence during their marriage. Angela's sister later told Dateline that Angela had called her in a panic one day after waking up and finding Richie in her living room. He allegedly said, "See, I told you I can get to you if I wanted to." Richie denied any involvement in the murder and claimed he was home all night. His wife Cynthia backed up his story, but it was considered a shaky alibi since she might be willing to lie for her husband. After finding a spot of Angela's blood in Richie's car, authorities charged him with murder. He refused to speak about the crime until shortly before his trial was scheduled, when he claimed that he and Chris had planned to confront Angela together because she had cheated on them both. Richie said that Chris took things too far and murdered Angela in a cold-hearted rage as he looked on helplessly. But Chris's workplace was filled with surveillance cameras, and the footage proved that he didn't leave his job that night. After deliberating for less than an hour, the jury convicted Richie of murder, and he was sentenced to life without parole. Months later, Cynthia's friend came forward to police with information they had suspected all along: that Cynthia not only knew about the murder, but was involved in masterminding it. The friend wore a wire which captured audio of Cynthia talking at length about how she and Richie had planned the murder for around 2 years. She kept tabs on Angela in the time leading up to the killing, which could perhaps explain why the victim felt she was being watched. Cynthia said with confidence to her friends that she believed the murder was necessary. She was arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and turned down a 25-year plea offer. Instead, she entered an Alford plea, which meant that she maintained her innocence but acknowledged that the prosecution likely had a strong enough case to secure a conviction. In a move that shocked everyone involved in the case, including the prosecution, the judge sentenced Cynthia to the maximum sentence of life in prison without parole. Number 2. Nicholas Fergus. During the early morning hours of April 25, 2010, 911 dispatchers in St. Paul, Minnesota received a phone call from Nicholas Fergus. He was in a hysterical state as he explained that a home intruder had shot his wife Heidi while she was trying to escape out the back door of their home. Officers arrived minutes later to find Heidi unresponsive and bleeding on the kitchen floor. She had been shot in the head and was pronounced dead at the scene. Nick had a gunshot wound to his leg and survived. During questioning, Nick Fergus claimed that 1 or 2 intruders broke into the house. At the time, he wasn't sure what they looked like, but he would later describe one of them as a tall black man. Nick said he grabbed his gun and he and Heidi made a run for it, but the burglar managed to wrestle the gun away from him and shot Heidi. Investigators' ears perked up when they learned that the couple was about to lose their home to foreclosure. In fact, they were supposed to move out the very next day. It would later be revealed that Heidi had no idea they were in financial trouble. Nick handled all the bills and had kept the foreclosure a secret from his wife. The case went unsolved for several years. In 2012, Nick remarried. His new wife, Rachel Fergus, later told 2020 that she initially felt bad for her husband over the trauma of losing Heidi, but she discovered and noticed that they were late on their property taxes and were facing foreclosure, something Nick had not told her about, and began to see a pattern of behavior that made her suspect that her husband may have been involved in Heidi's murder. In addition to being reckless with money, Nick was a habitual liar to the point where he lied about things that it made no sense to lie about. Not wanting to be Nick's next victim, Rachel divorced Nick and began speaking with law enforcement about Heidi's case. In the meantime, the FBI got involved and re-examined some of the evidence in hopes of spotting something that was missed during the initial investigation. In 2021, authorities concluded that they finally had enough evidence to arrest Nick and charged him with murder. He stubbornly maintained his innocence throughout his trial, and even after he was found guilty, and he continued to receive support from his friends and family throughout the trial. Nick Fergus was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Number 1. Brandon Thiesfeld. During the summer of 2019, 21-year-old University of Mississippi student Ali Costiel was mercilessly gunned down from behind at an abandoned fishing camp called Sardis Lake. Lafayette County investigator Jarrett Bundren later told 48 Hours that he had never seen a victim with so many gunshot wounds in his career. She was struck 9 times. Although Ali's phone was nowhere to be found, sheriff's deputies were able to track her text messages through her Apple Watch. It revealed that Ali had recently told a fellow student, Brandon Thiesfeld, that she thought she might be pregnant with his baby. She had also sent him a photo of an inconclusive pregnancy test. The two had a complicated relationship going back 3 years and hadn't seen each other in a few months. Ali wanted to meet up and talk, but Thiesfeld responded to the news of the possible pregnancy by telling her that he wasn't interested in meeting and urging her to get an abortion. He said a baby would ruin both their lives and that there was no way he could become a parent at that time. Then, after refusing to meet up with Ali repeatedly, Thiesfeld texted the young woman and asked if they could get together and talk. She was found dead the next morning. Further evidence linked him to the crime, and he was arrested for murder. Thiesfeld maintained his innocence, but the more police learned about his relationship with Ali, the more their suspicions grew. People who knew the young man described him as misogynistic, while Ali's friends recalled hearing stories about the outright degrading things he said to her. Most people agreed that Ali wanted a serious relationship, but that Thiesfeld wasn't interested in one. In fact, the two had never officially dated, despite their ongoing involvement with one another. Speaking with 48 Hours, Ali's friends and family described how she hoped to meet a Southern boy while away at college, preferably a future husband who she could see herself someday having kids with. She limited what she shared about Thiesfeld, but it was clear after she met him in 2016 that she was smitten. Perhaps she was blinded by love and continued to see Thiesfeld as the southern gentleman she had been looking for, even after it became clear that he wasn't the right person for her. Regardless of what kept the two coming back to one another for more, it ended in needless tragedy with one life taken and another ruined. Thiesfeld pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. He apologized to Ali's family in court but never revealed his motive, leaving her loved ones to speculate that he wanted to make sure that she didn't have his baby. Thanks for watching. If you had the opportunity to buy a beautiful house for an extremely low price and the only catch was that someone had been brutally murdered there in the past, would you take advantage of the offer or turn it down? Why or why not? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye!